morning, everyone. I'm Carol Valente. I'm a Senior Policy Associate here at Energy Consumers Australia. I've always started these webinars by saying that it was a pleasure to welcome you all to the session. And don't get me wrong, it's still an absolute pleasure, but today feels a little bit bittersweet because this is the last webinar of the series we're hosting on the 21st Century Energy System Planning. The first webinar was exactly a month ago, and I hope that you have all enjoyed and learned as much as I did in this past few weeks. So we got another big audience today with over 100 people registered and interested in hearing more about the future of gas network planning and in this journey to net zero. And integrating gas and electricity system planning is key to a successful and smooth energy transformation of the Australian energy sector. And this is a major priority for consumers, as all consumers will be the ones to face and bear the burden and costs of a poorly integrated or overbuilt energy system. So how do we ensure that gas planning supports instead of delays the energy transition? What's the role for gas in people's homes and small businesses? These and many others are some of the questions that we aim to address today. But before we go any further in the discussion, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, live, and work today. And I also pay my deepest respects to all elders, past, present, and emerging of the distinct lands on which you are all on today. As I've been mentioning in the previous webinars, Australia wasn't always my home. And for most part of my life, Australia was just a far, far away land with more kangaroos than people. And many years later, as I now choose to call Australia my home, and I learn more about the country, the First Nations, and their history, I learn more about respect. So I've been living in the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation for about 6 years now, and I acknowledge and respect that these always were and always will be Aboriginal lands. So what do we have planned for today? Well, Brian, our director of the Energy System Transition team, will give a quick overview of what electrification means for the gas networks and gas consumers and why we need to pay attention to gas system planning processes immediately. Then we'll have 3 keynote presentations from Richard Lowes, Claire Halbrook, and Tony Wood on the emerging developments, the policy recommendations, and best practices to responsibly plan the future of gas networks, having front of mind intended and perhaps more importantly, the unintended consumer impacts. After all these keynote presentations, Brian will convene and facilitate a panel discussion between the speakers and our representatives from DCCEEW and AEMO. And we'll also have time to take questions from the audience. So I encourage you to submit your questions during the keynote presentations and the panel discussion via the Q&A feature in your Zoom. So these are the 2 speech bubbles at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And you also have the opportunity to upvote questions, and we'll prioritize those that receive more votes. So yeah, over to you, Brian.
Thanks very much, Carol. And thanks everyone for joining us. I guess I just wanted to start and remind everyone why we're doing this series of webinars. So the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment, and Water is currently undertaking a review of the integrated system plan. And that looks broadly at what needs to change and, to ensure that Australia meets its climate commitments and does so in a way that, all Australians come along on the journey. It includes the gas network. Simultaneously, something else that's happened while that's been happening is the Department of Industry, Science and Resources has undertaken a national gas strategy. And so today's discussion may also be applicable for that. So I'd encourage you to, look online and learn more about both of those processes. But now let's just, I want to go fast and just sort of set the context as quickly as I can. So if you go to the next slide, Carol, you'll see we've just shown a slide from Geosciences Australia that really takes a 10,000-foot view of Australia's, or maybe even higher view of Australia's overall gas sector. So you can see that, we've got a 6,000 petajoules, which is a a whole lot of gas. Almost all of that is domestically produced, and almost all of it, more than 2/3 of it, is exported. Right, so that's the bulk of our gas leaves our shores. About 20%, 1,200 petajoules of that 6,000 petajoule supply is used domestically. And so you can see that really, if we, from an ECA perspective, we're talking about that 175 petajoules for residential customers, more for small business customers, but still, it's really a fraction of the overall gas supply chain and gas industry in Australia. It's even a fraction of the 445 petajoules used for gas-fired power generation plants, right? So that's another way Australian households and businesses get energy is through that electricity that gas is an important feedstock for. So you might look at this chart and say, well, what's the big deal? Why do we even need to worry about Australian households, and gas? It's a rounding error in the whole exercise. But if you go to the next slide, you'll see that gas is in 50% of our homes, right? So gas is a prevalent source of energy for half of Australian households. So this is a map from Energy Networks Australia. Basically shows that there's lots of gas. Most gas is concentrated in ACT and Victoria, who use it for home heating. But all states sort of use some gas residentially. Only a little bit is used in Queensland and Tasmania, and in fact, the gas distribution networks in Queensland and Tasmania are not subject to price regulation the way they are in the other NEM states or in WA. So if we go to the next slide. So my colleague Ashley Bradshaw does some great analysis on all sorts of things, and has taken his eye to gas recently and created both of these charts, which on the left show the annual change in residential gas customer numbers. So this is annual increase in gas connections, you might think of it, for the last 7 years or so. And you could argue that it looks like we're approaching that the peak happened in March 2019. Now, mind you, that data doesn't include Victoria. It's the NEM states except for Victoria, because Victoria isn't reported on. But it looks like the gas network may have already peaked. And if you look on the right, we've zoomed into Evo Energy, where it's likely that disconnections already are surpassing new connections. They're sort of kissing there. Last or 2 financial years ago. So given what's happened in the ACT recently, one might expect that those lines have well and truly crossed by now, and we're actually seeing negative customer growth in the ACT, and that is likely a trend that we'll see in other states. Let's look a little bit at why that is. So this is data from Andrew Turley, who will join us later, and who's been a great sport in participating in these webinars. He's responsible for forecasting.iemo.com.au, and great resource. So we went back to the 2022 ISP. There's actually updated projections for this, but we're using the 22 data for a reason you'll see in a second. But anyway, it basically shows that residential and business building electrification, so this doesn't include electric vehicles, slated to increase pretty dramatically from now, but most principally from 2030. So that electrification can have an unintended consequence, which is higher gas bills. So as many of you will know, Energy Consumers Australia hired the CSIRO to do some modeling and analysis for us on the energy transition, what it meant for consumers. And we found that electrification broadly was good for consumers. It helped save money on their overall energy bills, but it did have this unintended consequence of creating increases for residential gas bills for those who are unable to switch their their energy use from gas to electricity. And so the way, if you look at those, that chart on the right, we've broken down the bill into the three sort of principal component parts, which is blue is the wholesale cost of gas, red is the network bit, and then green is everything else. So you see wholesale gas costs are expected to drop drop quickly and then sort of stay pretty low. The green bit stays constant the whole time, but that red bit in the middle, the network cost, increases substantially because as some customers leave, the remaining customers, unless policy changes, are basically forced to pay for the existing gas network. Now it's unclear how that's like a simplistic model, and whether or not that expectation for how the sort of transition will go and how many customers are left will be realized. It could go faster or slower than that projection. So this really raises this fundamental question that we've asked in the box here at the bottom: how do we ensure gas distribution networks continue to operate safely, reliably, and affordably? All right, so on to the next question, or the next slide. Right, so we've actually seen these transitions before. I'd encourage everyone to look at sort of these RMI. There's an RMI website that looks at past energy transitions, and in fact, they've got this one where we've moved from gas to electricity before. So gas was common for public street lighting before the advent of electricity, and this what this chart shows is that in the UK, basically in the span of about a decade, gas went from its peak for use for lighting in about 2030 to 20% of that energy demand 10 years later. So these transitions can happen quickly. I don't think anyone expects this transition, the transition for gas for home heating and water heating, to go quite that fast, but it could. Okay, just a couple more slides. So I showed a version of this slide last time, which basically just shows that on the left there's 7 different processes under the national electricity rules for electricity planning. Gas planning is nothing nearly that robust. We really don't have robust gas planning processes today. Really, the best opportunity for gas distribution networks is what happens in these expenditure reviews. Let's talk about that real quickly. So next slide. And so this is kind of the big frustration, I think, from consumer advocates right now about, or one of the big frustrations about, the way that we plan gas networks relative to electricity networks. If you look on the left, we've got these are the scenarios now that are likely to be used in next year's ISP. They come from the most recent inputs, assumptions, and scenarios report. You see those scenarios are charted against the pace of Australia's decarbonization and then the energy sector's contribution to decarbonization across the NEM states. And so you get those 3 different scenarios. On the right is Gemina, which is the gas network in New South Wales, and the way that they've charted their scenarios, and the 2 axes they use are different than the axes used in the ISP. The level of renewable gas penetration is the x-axis, and the y-axis is, whether or not the transition is market-led or government-led. Is there a lot of government assistance or not in the transition? So both are valid approaches to developing scenarios, but if we do them so distinctly and differently, there's a chance that consumers end up paying for 2 separate contradictory energy transitions. One that looks at a future of electrifying buildings, and one that looks at biomethane or hydrogen as the way to decarbonize home heating. And that's the worst outcome, right? Because then we're paying twice for 2 different needs. So that needs to be resolved sooner or later. Hopefully our wonderful panelists can help us figure out how. So first, it's my pleasure to introduce Richard Lowe's from the Regulatory Assistant Project. Richard was asked to the pub 6 hours ago, 6.5 hours ago, and chose not to go and to come speak with us, which is our distinct pleasure, and we should be very grateful for that. So he recently wrote a report called Decompression, Policy and Regulatory Options to Manage the Gas Grid in a Decarbonizing United Kingdom. He knows a lot about this topic. We're really lucky to have him. Richard.
Thanks very much, Brian. Yeah, hi everyone. I think it was sensible not to go to the pub this evening, although it's Thursday night still here. So maybe there's still time afterwards. I'm just gonna share my screen. Great. Wonderful. Okay. So this is a briefing, or this presentation is based on a briefing which was supposed to be a blog, which grew and grew and grew after some internal work at RAP, and I'll say who RAP is in a second. But in a previous life, I worked for a gas distributor in the UK about 10 or 15 years ago now, in that sort of period. And I was leading thinking around what happens to the gas grid in the future. We just had the Climate Change Act brought in, and everyone was wondering what on earth is going to happen to heating and the gas grid. I left the gas industry and moved into academia, and have since moved to the Regulatory Assistance Project, and had been wanting to write this piece for some time. And we decided the blog didn't do it justice. And following some internal reviews and some meetings, it then became quite a significant briefing, which has been widely referenced in the UK media now. And I'm actually due to present this again, the same presentation tomorrow morning, in about 9 hours to the government. So this is good practice, but also it's great that there's some global interest here. So bit about RAP. You probably haven't heard of us. We're a very small not-for-profit think tank based in Vermont, but we have offices in Brussels, Germany, and we also have teams working on India and China, as well as the US and Europe. I live in the UK in the southwest. It's currently 10 degrees outside, pouring with rain and windy, as you'd expect. I'm quite pleased to actually not have gone to the pub, I think. And RAP's work is all focused on energy policy and making better energy policy to basically deliver a clean energy system. So a bit of context. So Brian showed that slide of the gas lighting switching towards electric lighting. What that graph didn't show was that the gas grid stayed in place and actually became, first of all, an asset for cooking. So people used the gas grid first for cooking because the grid owners were looking for an option to replace the lighting use. And it wasn't really until, I guess, after the Second World War that it was really used at scale for heating. There were developments in between the world wars in its use for heating, but only after the Second World War, when we had big discoveries of gas in the North Sea, did we really expand the system and join it all together. So it sort of doubled in size after the Second World War. So the asset grew and grew and grew to a point now where the vast majority of homes in the UK are connected to the gas grid, something like 85%. And that was all fine when we weren't concerned about climate change, and when we had loads of gas. And for much of the time since the 1970s, we've been basically providing all of our own gas, even exporting some at times. But that switched in 2000 when we started importing gas again. And we've now got to a situation where our reserves are so depleted that the UK is now importing about 50 or 60% of our gas, and we're expected to import basically all of our gas by about 2040. So there's a really big energy security issue here, as well as a climate change one. All of the UK's energy policy and regulation is bounded by the Climate Change Act. As of today, that also includes network regulation, with our regulator given a net zero duty to ensure that all of their decisions reflected the need to get to a decarbonised energy system by 2050. And we also know that from years of analysis and work and experiments and discussion that the scope for using decarbonised gas at scale is quite limited. We've got a very dense population, we've got lots of homes connected to the gas grid, and it's just impossible to produce enough low carbon gas to allow us to keep doing what we're doing with gas. And so naturally what that means is that before 2050, we've got to have switched lots of people, if not all people, off gas if we're going to meet our climate change targets. But the policy and regulatory environment is extremely complicated and slightly paradoxical, I'd say. Here's a picture about 10 minutes walk from me. That's my dog in the front, who's currently over to my right, sensibly asleep. And this is a gas pipe in the UK being replaced. So lots of the gas pipes are actually about 100 years old. And so they're reaching the end of their working lives. And so we've had this program since 2002 called the Iron Main's replacement program, which has basically been replacing all of these pipes with plastic pipes. I'll come back to the finances of this, but these pipes last for 100 years. And so if we're trying to get rid of gas heating by 2050 and we're putting pipes in the ground that last for 100 years, you can see there's an obvious tension there. And when we look at the actual numbers of what needs to happen, the rate of change is extreme. So there are two graphs here. The one on the left-hand side is the global picture, actually. So this is looking at the number of heat pumps and clean heating systems needed globally by 2050. And you can see it's a pretty rapid growth. And we're basically losing all of that gas and all of that coal and oil to be electrified. And this is the IEA's net zero scenario. And on the right-hand side, this is the UK's Climate Change Committee scenario, their balanced central scenario for heat pump deployment. And basically, we're expecting heat pumps to take up the lion's share of heat decarbonisation in the UK, a combination of heat pumps and heat networks in more urban areas. But what you can see is that we're talking actually about mass deployment of heat pumps, starting from very low levels now, but by 2025, 2026, reaching very high levels, and then basically reaching a point in 2035 when we're peaking at deployment because we've actually stopped installing gas boilers altogether, stopped installing replacement boilers. And at that point, we're talking about something like 1.6 million heat pumps being installed a year, and therefore 1.6 million people potentially disconnecting from the gas grid in 1 year. So naturally, this issue of what to do about the gas grid is a huge regulatory issue, and it's also a very difficult regulatory issue because there are big interests. It's politically difficult because we have a government at the moment that isn't particularly keen on forcing people to do things. I'm happy to encourage, but not to force. And there's a combination of factors at play here. So basically, Brian alluded to this point earlier, as more people switch away from gas, if all else stays the same and the grid stays the same, the cost of running the grid sits over an ever-decreasing number of customers, basically putting up bills for people that remain on the gas grid. Now, that could be seen as a positive thing because it will be increasing gas prices relative to electricity, but has potential to create a death spiral. It's not clear that would be the same as a sort of solar PV type disconnection death spiral, but nonetheless, it could create a feedback loop. And linked to that, there's a risk that people that can't afford to switch get totally stuck. So this is a key equity issue, we think. And the second point is that even if we stop investing today, and we keep investing, so that's not going to happen, but even if we were to stop investing today, while the network assets depreciate, so that is they reduce in value every year because the shareholders get some of their money back to pay off their investments, currently it's a 45-year process. And so what that means is that there will still be a financial value to the gas networks beyond 2050, in fact, way beyond 2050. And if we continue the Iron Main's replacement program to 2032, when it's expected to close, that's going to take us all the way into the 2070s, way beyond when we're supposed to be decarbonised. And the final big thing, which is even trickier, I guess, is the fact that actually decommissioning the grid will have a cost. So it is a very significant network in the UK. We've got huge mains going through the centres of cities. Basically, every large area has gas. It's only really remote areas that don't. And it's going to cost a lot to deal with it. We don't quite know how we'll do it yet. We don't know whether we can just leave the pipes, whether we need to fill them with concrete, whether we can fill them with sand, fill them with air, leave some of it in the ground. But costs of decommissioning the grid range from a sort of fairly minimal £8 billion to an extreme £136 billion, with the government's advisors recently saying it's somewhere in the middle. But nonetheless, you're talking a significant level of funding, equatable to perhaps 2 nuclear power stations. So just to major on these points, it is a huge issue for the climate. If we don't decommission this gas grid, we're not meeting our climate change targets. And as a developed country with significant economic and political power, we should be taking a lead here. It's a major consumer issue because if we don't do this properly, there's a risk that people will pay a huge amount of money. We risk just wasting money if we don't sort this out quickly. And finally, it's a big energy security issue. And I think this bit's often forgotten, but we are entering uncharted territory when it comes to gas imports. And I find that particularly concerning. I'm concerned about climate change, but I think actually the more immediate impact to the UK will be around energy security. And we've already been heavily impacted by the impacts of the Russian war, which basically tripled or more to our gas prices. So this is just a graph which I took from a previous report, which was done for the Climate Change Committee, which basically had a scenario whereby you stopped investing, which we haven't done yet, but assume we stopped investing and people are switching away from the gas grid, and you end up basically quadrupling the distribution charges. And so currently people spend about £150 on the gas grid per household in the UK each year. We're talking of those levels reaching £600 for gas grid alone. And this is actually a scenario which doesn't go all the way. This is a scenario which goes part the way to decarbonisation and also includes some continued gas use. So this is basically a good scenario. So potentially those costs would be a lot more. And if everyone switched off, obviously there's a huge impact because that final person ends up having to pay for this £20 billion asset. Just to say a quick word on how we also regulate these grids. So I've mentioned this 45-year timing at the moment. What this means is that the companies who own the gas grid, so all of the gas grids in the UK are privately owned. They're based around a regulatory asset value. So the companies bought them, they were told they were worth X, and since then they've been able to add things and things depreciate. And if you add something, that asset has a 45-year financial lifetime, which means the company finances it, and then the costs of recouping that investment are spread across consumers' bills for 45 years. You can see if we start from today, and broadly this is accurate, the value of the gas grid in the UK is about 20 billion, as I mentioned previously. With this 45-year depreciation, we're talking way beyond 2050. So there's already a stranded asset cost in the UK that we can foresee. That is pretty obvious to everyone. It used to be that we had this straight line depreciation, but the regulator decided that was a bit too risky because the stranded asset risk was higher than they thought it needed to be. And so in 2012, I think it was, this new approach called sum of digits depreciation, which basically is a smooth curve, was introduced. And what that means is that we pay off some of the assets early. So you pay off a bit of it earlier, but it's still a 45-year timeline, and we're still talking about multiple billions of value still in the networks. Just to add, if we keep continuing to invest, which we are doing, this risk increases, and actually we're looking at, as I said earlier, going on to beyond 2070. So there is a real question over whether this model that we've got, where we've got 4 companies, all basically the companies which are incentivized to invest as much money as possible into these grids, in a situation where the government's effectively trying to shut the gas grids down in an accelerated timeline. And I think there's a big regulatory and policy question over whether it's appropriate or even possible to try and wind down a private company ahead of time. It's politically, it does look very difficult. And I think there's a broad question over whether the private sector is the right model to own networks that are being actively wound down by the government, because there are obvious conflicts at play there. So that's just a question I just want to pose to you. On the subject of decommissioning costs, as I said, these costs range vastly from, I've seen 8 billion, so that shouldn't be £8, that should be £8 billion, to £136 billion. So significant costs per household potentially. Interestingly, a higher number for decommissioning costs is better for the networks, and we're already seeing a play by the network companies to make this look very expensive. And indeed, that £136 billion number came from the networks, from some analysis that they'd commissioned, and the government's number is much lower. But by making the decommissioning cost look very high, you can, of course, make the alternatives look a lot more expensive, basically, because you don't have to decommission the gas grid. And we've seen this already become a key lobbying line. And I expect it will become a key lobbying line for gas networks around the world as they look to protect their assets. And I'd point out that research and innovation in this area is very underdeveloped. If you were ever thinking about what an interesting project would be, it would be how you can cheaply decommission the gas grids, or how you can innovate to find a better use for them to get some value out of that sunk investment. So we basically came up with 3 options for how you could deal with this problem. I'll just briefly talk through them, but I don't think too much detail is needed because they're fairly self-explanatory. The first model is basically business as usual. You regulate the networks as they are, but you just make that 45-year period shorter. So we'd call that accelerated depreciation, and that means that the sunk asset risk is limited or potentially eliminated, because if you reduce it down to 25 years, that's going to take us to 2050. It's not totally eliminated because lots of people may switch off in an unsmooth process, but it certainly reduces the risk of those stranded asset costs. But that doesn't deal with decommissioning costs. And so if you were to fully sort of reflect those costs to the market, or reflect the economic costs to the customers, you'd need to do accelerated depreciation, which would of course put up bills in the short term because you're recouping the money quicker, but you'd also want to develop a decommissioning fund at the same time. Both of those things cost something, and that would need to be considered from an equity perspective. There's a second model, we think, which is where you encourage the networks to do something else. We call it evolutionary regulation, but you could encourage them to deliver heat pumps, deliver heat networks, something else, but something that gives them some skin in the game rather than it purely being a negative story. And I think how that works would vary depending on where you are in the world and the type of governance you've got. For example, in some Northern European countries, the Netherlands being a good example, where local authorities tend to own most of the networks, you can sort of see how that would work, and joint decisions could be made which are of value to the community broadly. And the final model is one whereby it's nationalized. You just buy the whole thing back and take it into the state, and then you wind it down, but you treat that more like a project. And this is obviously a big change, particularly for the UK, not necessarily for other European countries. Denmark's already done it, but for countries with liberalised energy systems, this would be a big change. But potentially when you reach the stage where you've got mass exit of gas customers, it's difficult to see how the private sector could manage that and how regulators could manage the private sector to do that. So made a few policy recommendations, and this is final slide before my quick conclusions. The first one is just to try and understand this a bit better. So policymakers don't have much clue about what's going on here, don't have much clue about how much it will cost, and therefore the risks aren't appreciated properly yet. So there's a lot of learning to be done here, and the sooner that can be done, I think the better. We've made a recommendation that Ofgem, who is the network regulator, the independent regulator in the UK, needs to work much more closely with the government department, which is the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, to work up a plan here, because currently Ofgem says the government's not made a decision on the gas grid, and the government says gas grid regulation is an issue for the regulator, and that won't work for much longer. There's got to be a joint plan here because there's so much money at stake and significant equity risks potentially. Third one is around this iron mains replacement or risk reduction program. That's the new pipes I was showing you. We need to really think about whether that's a sensible thing to do. I mean, it's probably not. There are obvious safety issues for replacing gas pipes if needed, but wholesale replacement probably doesn't make sense. And I just think we've got to take a more sensible and pragmatic approach to that. Sorting out problems rather than just throwing loads of capital at this. It is still £1 billion a year programme. And we also need to ensure that approaches to local energy planning and heat and wider policy are coordinated, because currently these are all treated as separate silo issues. We've got grants for heat pumps, we've got local authorities doing planning, and we've got Ofgem regulating networks, but none of these things are joined up. So just to quickly conclude, Decommissioning the gas grid in the UK is an inevitability because of our existing laws. Only if those laws change will it no longer be inevitable, and that seems quite unlikely. There's a significant stranded asset risk, and one that we as a country are creating and continuing and perpetuating by pouring more money into the grid. And there's also decommissioning cost risk. Both of those things are big risks in their own right, but together they're a significant problem. I'd say that fundamentally this is an issue about equity and making sure that the costs are shared appropriately, because both of these elements, the stranded asset bit and the decommissioning bit, will cost something. Potentially the value is there because electrification is widely looking cheaper than sticking with the status quo, but there are costs here and capital costs that need to be shared appropriately between the right people, be that taxpayers, customers, which customers, and so on. And I think what's going to happen is that the regulator is going to do what it can. It's going to look at accelerated depreciation in the next price control. This is the regulatory period, which starts in 2026. And if things do start to happen quickly, and we do get these mass exit rates of millions of homes a year, it does look like some form of renationalisation would be needed. But looking at current rates of deployment, it's not 100% clear that's going to happen in my lifetime, although hopefully it will. Thank you. That's everything.
That was fantastic, Richard. Thank you. So interesting to see what's happening in your side of the world. And thanks again for joining us so late. We're going to keep going west now, all the way to California, and talk to Claire Halbrook, director at Gridworks. So Claire has a really fascinating history. She worked at Pacific Gas and Electric, the largest utility in the U.S., and helped sort of them think through and advocated internally for a transition off the gas network there. She now works sort of California-wide on a project known as California's Gas System in Transition. She'll tell us a little bit about that, I think, and some of the rest of the work that she has underway. So thanks, Claire.
All right. Thank you, Brian. Yes, hello, everyone. My name is Claire Halbrook. I am currently a director at Gridworks. Gridworks is a nonprofit organization that focuses on convening and facilitating conversations amongst stakeholders, working to decarbonize our economy. At Gridworks, we've been working about the last 5 years on a variety of projects and papers related to long-term gas system planning. And as Brian mentioned, I spent 7 years at Pacific Gas and Electric Company, and through a variety of roles there, ended up working on the company's long-term gas planning. So if we can go to the next slide. Next, please, Carol. All right, so I'm going to share a little bit today about California's kind of journey as it relates to gas system planning. And this slide is about where we began, which was constructing and socializing this graph that you see in the bottom left-hand corner. While I was at PG&E, we developed a version of this for the company. This one in particular was developed through a Gridworks process that was done in collaboration with a variety of stakeholders, utilities, labor, environmental groups, consumer advocates, et cetera, a couple of years ago. And this graph is for California as a whole. The majority of our gas utilities in the state are investor-owned, privately owned utilities. So what you see in the top line here is the growing revenue requirement for gas utilities in California. You'll see how it increases over time at a rate that significantly exceeds inflation, which is represented as the dotted line labeled CPI. And this growth is really due to a couple of factors. First and foremost, it's just becoming more expensive to install and maintain infrastructure due to the cost of labor and materials. Then secondly, in California and across the US, gas utilities are facing an expansion in safety regulations. And the third is unfortunately a fairly extensive backlog of work that hasn't yet been tackled. So at the same time that this revenue requirement line is going up, we are seeing revenue collected from, quote, reasonable rates. If we were to keep rates more or less growing at CPI, you would see this gray line and this growing gap between revenue and revenue requirement. And this dip in revenue as a result of declining demand for gas is due to a couple of factors. One is just what we call economic electrification. As electric appliances become more affordable for certain customers that say have solar, switching to electric just makes sense. As well as being driven by policies that are intended to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve indoor and outdoor air quality. And you see this decline in revenue, importantly, as the image on the right represents, regardless of what you do, regardless of whether your approach to reducing emissions from the gas system come from investing in renewable natural gas and hydrogen, because those are more expensive commodities, you see an increase in gas rates. As a result of economic electrification, you see a reduction in gas consumption. And then obviously, if you're leveraging electrification as one of your primary strategies to reduce emissions in the building sector, you're going to see gas demand fall. So you get caught in this loop no matter what. And you see revenue requirements growing for gas utilities as a result of a variety of factors that are unrelated to our climate objectives. So I think what the Gridworks report, where these images are sourced, really, it offers a variety of recommendations, but the most important message is that we need to get serious about long-term gas planning in California if we want to avoid this future with a $26 billion NPV gap between revenue requirement and revenue for our gas utilities. And I think really fortunately, our Public Utilities Commission listened to this recommendation from stakeholders and has begun taking action alongside other state agencies, local governments, utilities, consumer groups, and nonprofits. Thanks, Carol, for going to the next slide. So as you see here, I'm not going to go through all of this today, but Brian did ask me for an overview of the current Public Utilities Commission proceeding. It's been quite extensive, and I wanted to ensure you have a complete snapshot of what that's been like and the many materials for some later tea time reading. So I think most importantly here is that while California has had a very extensive long-term planning process for our electric utilities, it's called our Integrated Resource Planning Effort, or IRP, we don't have a similar process for our gas utilities. And our Public Utilities Commission is now really working diligently to collect input from stakeholders on issues far and wide, so it can begin tackling a number of these incredibly complex topics related to long-term gas planning. And by making these materials public through, say, the workshops, which are listed here that cover a wide variety of topics, they're helping everyone learn and reduce information asymmetry, which is really important because when I first started in this area for PG&E and then for Gridworks, we see a lot of our stakeholders who participate in Public Utilities Commission proceedings being really familiar with the electric system. It's gotten the majority of the attention over the last few years, and they lack the understanding of how the gas system works, how it's paid for, and how the planning processes work. And so it's been important to bring them along in this journey through some education. So if we can go to the next slide. So I want to note that this very methodical approach that the Public Utilities Commission has been taking also means that there are a couple of steps behind kind of what I would call the industry zeitgeist in California. So now I want to turn and go past that CPUC proceeding and share a little bit about what I think stakeholders are kind of considering as pieces of our solution set for the problem that I showed on my first slide. So for each of these pieces of the solution, I'm kind of going to lay out the concept, who's been taking the lead on it in California or who should, and the status of implementation. And I want to acknowledge that there's probably more pieces to the solution puzzle that are going to come in future years. We're probably going to need more solutions, and we'll be learning a lot along the way. So I think the kind of far end of this slide has yet to be developed. So the first piece of the solution set is limiting expansion of the gas system, and that's done through all electric new construction. In California, it's our state and local governments that have a major role in shaping our building codes and our health and safety codes. So in California now, our building code across the state considers heat pumps as a baseline technology. And if you choose to build a home or other building without a heat pump, you face additional energy efficiency requirements. And we've also seen our local governments in California pass what we call REACH codes, which means local governments can go past the state building codes and enforce more strict mandates than the state. And we've seen that in over 30 cities across California. The next is really requiring all electric appliances upon burnout. So basically changing the customer solution set. In the same way that you can no longer purchase arsenic-based wallpaper or lead paint across most of the world, we're saying that you shouldn't be able to purchase appliances that we know are bad for human health and for the environment. The way that they've started working on this in California is through what we call our air quality management districts. There's a handful of them across the state. And the one in the Bay Area has recently released some new regulations saying that water heaters and furnaces sold in the Bay Area cannot emit NOx as of 2027 and 2029 due to their impacts on smog and thus human health and air quality around the Bay Area. I think there's a variety of ways to get at changing what appliances are available for purchase for consumers, continuing to give them extensive choice around what type of appliances they buy, but perhaps removing some of those that we know to be bad for human health and the environment. The next is avoiding major replacement projects. So reducing the amount of further capital we're investing in our gas system when we know that there's a potential that it will not be used and useful over the duration of its life. The majority of gas pipes in California are considered to have a 60-year life, which take us well past many of our very ambitious climate goals beyond 2050. There's a couple of ways to do that. One is through electrifying areas rather than replacing the pipe. Another that we haven't yet quite pursued much in California, but is getting a lot of attention elsewhere, is through converting people to using thermal energy, which captures waste heat and shares heat and cooling across a variety of buildings underground. That has a real benefit because gas utilities could potentially convert to being thermal energy utilities and help offset the reduction in their revenue they might see from declining usage on their gas system, and also gives their employees an opportunity for a just transition to new work that's largely similar to what they do now. And the last is derating of pipes. This is a particular thing in California and in the US, where you can derate a pipe by reducing the pressure on the line so that it's no longer classified as a transmission line. Those transmission lines, obviously for safety reasons, have a lot more requirements around operations, maintenance, and replacement schedules. So we're seeing this one through a project I'm a part of and is on my next slide. An Energy Commission research project. Sorry, not yet, Carol. If you can go back, thank you. We see these small scale pilots from Pacific Gas and Electric Company, and we see a recent PUC decision on this topic. The last potential piece in the solution set is how to fund early retirement. This is leveraging financial strategies to pay for those remaining assets that have yet to be fully depreciated that are in the ground. That's likely need to come from our legislature and or regulatory commission. And at this point, we're really still in the theoretical consideration phase. You have options like securitization, accelerated depreciation, reduced return on equity, and just entirely disallowing recovery. You could combine some of these options or use them in isolation. The end of my presentation in the appendix, I have graphs and a link to a report that does a great job illustrating all of these concepts. So last slide, please, Carol. So this last one is a research project that I am a part of that asks the question of how can we achieve net savings while prioritizing the needs of local communities through gas decommissioning and electrification projects. Through this, we've been working for about 2 years to develop a replicable framework for identifying ideal locations for pursuing these kind of projects, where you have the opportunity to avoid a major investment in the gas system, how to identify where those locations are, and do the analysis to see if they're a good fit for electrification as an alternative to gas service. Then to take that framework we've developed, identify a couple of pilot locations, and develop plans for implementing those projects and analyze the cost effectiveness of these projects. I have a link here to our website on this project. There's an interim report and a number of blog posts. As I mentioned, Pacific Gas and Electric in California has been a major leader in this space, and there's a great summary of their recent work on this slide as well. So that's it from me. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Claire. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed every part of that presentation. That research project at the end, I think, is one that we've thought about similar things here in Australia. That there's certainly a lot to learn there. The multi-pronged solution set was great, and as well as learning about, thanks for including all of that information about what's happening at the CPUC, because that, I think, for policymakers can be especially helpful in thinking about how to frame these questions. So without further ado, on to our next speaker, who needs no introduction, Tony Wood, who's the Energy and Climate Change Program Director at the Grattan Institute. I'm sure he's a familiar face to many of you. He's a member of the Order of Australia in recognition of his significant service to conservation and the environment. He's recently the co-author of a report that many of you will know, and it's very well titled, Getting Off Gas, Why, How, and Who Should Pay. Thanks for spending some time with us, Tony.
Great. Thank you, Brian. I think what you'll see in these first two presentations, and now with mine as well, is that there are very similar issues, but there are also different circumstances and also very different extents to which the problem and the potential solutions have been understood and embraced. And part of what I'm going to say today illustrates the Australian challenge, but also illustrates that this is actually a very difficult issue. It's not difficult in techno-economic sense. It's difficult in a political and social sense. And that makes it harder for everybody, including our political leaders, to really get on with this. So next slide, please, Carol. I'm going to just quickly move through a report that we wrote recently. As Brian said, one of the first things you need to think about in the case of Australia is that the way we use gas varies dramatically across the country. We've got a big country, roughly the size of the United States, with a population of 25 million versus 350 million or whatever it is in the US. So the weather patterns across our large country are very different, and that is absolutely results in the sort of differences you see in this chart. So you'll see that the proportion of gas that's used by households and small businesses in Queensland and Western Australia is very small as a proportion of the total, whereas the proportion of gas used by households and small businesses in South Australia and so in Victoria and the ACT, Canberra, is much bigger. And that just reflects weather patterns. In the case of Victoria, it also reflects history, because Victoria is physically much closer to the historical source of gas. The way we think about the transition away from gas is therefore going to be quite different. For example, if we stop using gas in Queensland, where it's mostly been used for cooking, you wouldn't notice the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. But in the case of Victoria, Victoria does not achieve its greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets without getting households and small businesses off using gas. So that's a big deal. And I reiterate something that Brian said, is that sometimes people say that's a reason not to do it. But I'd also point out that even though our numbers aren't as big as the sort of numbers that Richard was talking about, in the case of Victoria, if we were to take those 2 million odd households off gas over the next 20 odd years, it would be at the rate of 200 households every day. Now, those numbers, again, aren't quite as big as the numbers Richard mentioned, but it is a significant planning, logistical, and manpower issue that needs to be thought through if we're going to do this really well. Next slide, please, Carol. I'm going to cover in this presentation, in addition to some of the financial issues you've heard from both Carol and Richard, but I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other concerns that have been raised about our, sorry, I meant Claire, not Carol, about the sort of recommendations of this report. Now, some of these will be raised by people who genuinely have a serious vested interest in this challenge, the people who own the networks. And it's not surprising that they are going to raise these sort of concerns. And for example, what's been suggested is that, well, why don't we just put another gas inside these gas pipelines that would still be producing the same amount of energy at the household level. And one of them is biomethane and the other one is hydrogen. Well, in the case of biomethane or biogas, that's a product that comes mostly from agricultural waste, municipal waste and so forth, because the waste would have generated arguably the methane anyway as it gradually rotted. In this case, if we use it, then in theory, at least, it's a net zero emission source. But in the case of biomethane, one of the other consequences of our large country is most of the sources of this stuff are a long way from where the people are. And secondly, we don't have that much of it. So we're probably better off keeping biomethane for other much more difficult issues where electrification is not a simple answer. In the case of hydrogen, which is very commonly considered to be an alternative, the problem with hydrogen, again, it's very expensive, particularly is if you make it from clean hydrogen, that is renewable hydrogen made from renewable energy, it looks to be very expensive for quite a while yet. And you can see from this chart, the yellowy orangey line at the top, the cost of hydrogen, even in the best projections we've seen of what might be the cost of hydrogen over the next 25, 30 years, never gets to be cheaper than the cost of electricity. One of the reasons, of course, is if you're going to make green hydrogen from renewable energy, then the cheaper the renewable energy gets, it brings down the cost of hydrogen, but it also brings down the cost of electricity. So if you're going to do that, you might as well electrify in the first place. Now, it's not quite as simple as that, but that's the fundamental issues that arise when you think about hydrogen. Next slide, please, Carol. Now, one of the issues in Australia is for most Australians, they would be financially better off if they were using electricity rather than gas. That's not always been the case, but the cost of gas has been increasing quite substantially over the years. You'll see in this chart the range of savings. These are net savings of people in different states of Australia, again, varies quite significantly. Part of that reason is because the colder places where we use more gas for heating our homes in particular, the ACT at the bottom, and in Melbourne, in Victoria, a second from the top, you'll see the savings are much bigger because we use more gas and gas is much more expensive. And you'll see on the left-hand side, Western Australia or Perth, where gas is very cheap indeed, and at least for now, gas remains cheaper. The reason there's quite significant bars from the biggest savings to the smallest savings depends upon whether you've got 1, 2, or 3 appliances. That is, cooking, hot water, or home heating makes a big difference as to what you replace them with. And of course, it also will depend individually on what sort of appliances you have, what sort of appliances you want to buy, et cetera, et cetera. And we always assume that something Richard pointed out, this should not be a forced transition. If we try and force this on people, of course, they won't like it. And of course, there'll be a lot of objections and resistance. That's going to happen anyway. But if we do a good communications program and explain to people what we're doing, why we're doing it, and for most people, how they'll actually be financially better off, we've got a much better chance. And what we're suggesting is that we don't do this overnight. We do this over the next 20 odd years. And that means that as people have a situation they can plan for when their gas appliance is no longer operable, that's the time they should replace their gas appliance with an efficient electrical appliance. And that's the assumption we've made here. Next slide, please, Carol. The other thing that gets raised sometimes is, well, in some cases, if you switch to electricity now, because we're using clean natural gas, our emissions won't come down. Well, if you look on the left-hand side, for the different states of Australia, that's actually true. In the case of Victoria, we produce most of our electricity from brown coal. The emissions are very high. And at least for now, if you switched from gas electricity overnight, your emissions would actually go up. And you'll see, this varies by the other states of Australia, the opposite applies. And in the case of Canberra, there is no orange bar. That's because in Canberra, 100% of the electricity is financed by renewable energy. Of course, over the next 10 years, things change very dramatically. And that's because over the next 10 years, we are planning to, and we are gradually doing, the closure of the coal-fired power stations. And you'll see that even in Victoria, over a 10-year period, if you switch from gas to electricity, you will save money. And that is the important issue, I think, that this transition of moving away from coal and moving away from gas, broadly speaking, needs to be aligned with the movement away from gas for homes and small businesses and everything else. Next slide, please. This relates to a point that this slide is something that Brian raised, and that is it's a fundamental principle in life. If you're in a deep hole and you're in trouble, then the best thing you can do is stop digging. At the moment, even though we've got a lot of people who are disconnecting from the network, and it varies across the states of Australia, as you can see there, the dark red shows that people are disconnecting. And these numbers, the vertical axis is thousands. But of course, we're also getting actually in Australia at the moment, we are still connecting new people to the gas grid. And this is a situation that's been aggressively changing. It's starting to come down, but not as fast as we need. It will not happen by natural attrition. And so what we've suggested, we should stop digging. And one of the recommendations we made in our report, it's interesting that since we published that report, the Victorian government has now made a decision that there'll be no new gas connections for households and small businesses, or new buildings effectively, and new buildings, that is, from the beginning of next year. And that will mean that the shape of that chart, second from the left, will change dramatically over the next couple of years alone. The ACT, the right-hand side, is also doing something like this. They've already announced that they're going to move away from gas, and they're working through the process steadily and knocking off the many different challenges that arise, because every house, every building, every apartment is different, and all the physical issues are very different. Next slide, please, Carol. The other thing about appliances is that right now, the cost of gas appliances often is more expensive, is higher than the cost of the existing, is cheaper, sorry, than the existing electrical appliances. So you can see on the left-hand side there right now, if you replace like with like, an induction cooktop will cost you about $400 more than gas. Now, that's always the case. You can buy a perfectly good single induction plate from someone like IKEA for less than $100. If you're wanting to buy a pretty good stove, that's different. And equally, if you go to the right-hand side, you will see that appliances do cost less. If you want air conditioning, if you've got an air conditioning system or buying an air conditioning system, good news, your air conditioning system will actually run for heating as well as cooling. Next slide. So I won't spend too much time on this issue because a lot of it's been covered by both Claire and Richard. But the issue we've got is who should pay for this issue as the numbers of users are declining, and as we have to think about maintaining a safe network. So I just jump over this slide, I think, because we've already covered that well enough by Claire and Brian. Oh, this is a slide that just tries to show, again, something that Richard put up, how different the costs are. On the left-hand side is you've got all these graphs of the same number of customers, and between 2020 and 2050, this is a theoretical simple calculation, is if you kept everything the same with a static customer base and everything was depreciated as it is now, the costs of the distribution network will be flat, about $150, $125 a year. If, on the other hand, you allowed a growing customer base, then of course the cost per customer would gradually come down from $120 to $90 a customer. If, however, we then allow accelerated depreciation of the asset, which is both Claire and Richard have referred to, the costs go up significantly from $150 to $330 every year from now until 2050. Even worse, if we have a shrinking customer base at the same time as we're applying accelerated depreciation, the cost per customer go from about $330 in 2020, which is twice what we pay today, double that again by 2050. So again, you can see the dramatic impact on costs. And the final slide, please, Carol. So these are some of the more contentious issues that we need to deal with. Firstly, well, electrification is more expensive for consumers. Well, no, it's not. For the vast majority of consumers, electrification will be cheaper for consumers over the cycle now. There will be many consumers who can't afford to make the investments to save the money in the longer term. That's a tricky problem, particularly for people on low incomes. There's clearly a role for government to step in there, or financiers. And one of the things that we've recommended is the government's work with the banks, put in place financial packages. And there's already some evidence that both the state government in a couple of states and the Commonwealth government are supporting consumers to pay off those appliances where the overall economic benefit will actually be positive. Emissions from homes and small businesses isn't big enough to worry. Well, I think I've covered that one. Switching from to electricity won't reduce emissions. Well, it will, but that will only happen in some cases over time. We can't afford to wait for hydrogen or biomethane, because even if in the best cases the cost of hydrogen got anywhere near the cost of electricity, that won't happen until the late 2040s. And by then, the climate war has been well and truly lost. Having a second energy supplier provides greater comfort. And there's been examples where when the gas system actually failed in Victoria, where having electricity was a good idea. Well, that's a pretty expensive option for most people. And then there are multiple transition issues. I won't bore you with all these, but I can address them in the Q&A, is that in addition to the issues that both Richard and Claire raised, there's the issue of, I live in an apartment. My gas is paid for through my body corporate. How can I affect that? I don't have, I rent a home. What do I do about that? What do you do with landlords and renters? All those sorts of things. Fundamentally, this is only going to happen successfully if there's a plan to which everybody's signed up and consumers know what's happening, and there's a deal in place with the gas companies. It won't be an easy deal to negotiate, in which they're committed to, or someone who's going to operate this system for the next 30 odd years is committed to supporting the transition away from gas to electricity. That's the important issue for these customers. Now, of course, there will be more complicated issues associated with customers who use gas, like industrial customers who use gas for other things and they want really high temperature heat. Different problem to be solved. Also, where we use gas for power generation, different problem to be solved. There are lots of problems here, but as Brian said at the very beginning, there is no choice. We have to address climate change. Electrification is the way to do it. We need to get on with it, but we can't pretend it's going to be easy or cheap. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Tony. Love your work. So I'm going to invite everyone else to put your cameras back on. To just summarize, I think what Tony said in his report says we need a plan, right? And so, there's current reviews underway by the Commonwealth to look at planning, and so maybe this should be part of them. All right, so we're so it's everyone who's spoken beforehand, plus Andrew Turley, who is looking forward to getting his Friday mornings back. He's the group manager of forecasting at AEMO, and Kirsty Rolls, who has been uber generous with her time. She's the acting manager of the ISP review. She also is looking forward to getting Friday mornings back. I'm going to try and talk less. So Andrew or Kirsty, do you have a question for the panel?
Listen, I'm happy to jump in there, Brian. So thanks very much for all the presentations. They're really useful. I think my main concern is, obviously with the difference in the regulatory framework for gas and putting consumers at the heart of this issue, because obviously, gas companies will do what they need to make a profit. How do we ensure investment in critical infrastructure, which is needed to support consumers through the transition, continues? And in particular, how do we sort of consider that issue about fairly distributing the costs across the energy sector?
I can have a go. The last one is the more contentious, I think, Kirsty. So let's have a go at the most difficult one first. Look, I think the challenge here is that there's no simple solution to this. You've only got three entities who are going to pay for this, right? One is the consumers, the other one is the shareholders, and the third one is government. And of course, when I say government, I mean / taxpayers. And that means that there needs to be what we've called a grand bargain. The only way you're going to solve this is to come up with a way. I mean, Richard referred to renationalisation. That's the government. Maybe it's going to be shared between all three. One of the tricky ones, of course, I think, Kirsty, is, and this is the fairness question, is that the people who can afford now, and that's why we are seeing disconnections increasing across the states of Australia without regulatory change, the people who can afford to get off gas are doing it. They're saving money, but the people who are left behind. Now, in the past, the fact that we had a growing number of customers offset those customers who are leaving. But in the future, and not very long term away from here, that's going to change. And that's where those charts that Richard put up become very clear. The cost for the consumers left that cannot be allowed. Unfortunately, our regulators and industry and government have ignored this problem for far too long. We should have started this transition 20 years ago. And as a result of that, instead of having 40 years to do the transition, we've got 20. And that's part of the problem, I think. So we have to get on top of this. It may not be quite as important in Queensland and Western Australia, but I think it's unavoidable that there's got to be a plan here, and we've got to start, because the sooner we start, the better. And the fairness is a really important question, and it's got to be thought through. But we cannot just simply say, well, that's too hard.
Andrew, anything from you? You got a question?
I do have a question. Look, it's been really quite an interesting discussion with similarities, I guess, across each of the jurisdictions. One of the things that I'm very interested, I guess, is we talked about the electrification solution as being, I guess, the primary one, that this erosion of gas consumers will, I guess, deteriorate the financials of the gas system. But the flip side, of course, is that the electrification of householders, of businesses, etc., are also putting investment needs on the electricity grid, and there likewise needs to be a amount of investment to ensure that we aren't short of electricity supply to meet the growing needs of a transitioned or an electrified consumer base. So I guess I'm wondering, as the panel sort of see any particular issues with, or how should electricity investments, and how do they in California and in the UK, etc., ensure that we have those infrastructure investments in place in time, ready for the gas consumers to start to use electric alternatives, and that electricity consumers pay for those investments to enable that. How do we ensure that just in time isn't always too late, and that there still is that equity between electricity consumers, gas and consumers, and, almost to Kirsty's point, energy consumers as the recipients of that infrastructure?
Yeah, I could start with that one. So this is Claire Halbrook from Gridworks, representing California. So I think the first piece is that it's really important, as we are transitioning homes off of the gas grid, that it's done with a whole home approach, so that we're beginning with energy efficiency, weatherization, so that those appliances can be right-sized, and then that those appliances are controllable and capable of responding to load management programs. So that means they can go from not, first of all, not being an added burden on the electric grid to potentially being an asset that you don't currently have. And then if you add something like a battery and rooftop solar, you're really getting a lot of both resiliency benefit and controllable load benefit out of that. The next is we're seeing, a lot of our electric grid needs upgrades as it relates to transportation electrification already. And a lot of our grid in California in particular is being revisited to improve resiliency and reduce wildfire risk. So this is where the point of integrated resource planning, so not just doing electric planning and gas planning, but doing them together, gets to be really important, so that you're concentrating your investments and coordinating your investments, and doing that in a timely fashion, neighborhood by neighborhood. So in our pilot project, really trying to identify areas where the electric grid is ready to host new load, and if it's not, flagging those as needed upgrade areas, and finding out if they need other upgrades to allow for transportation and resiliency.
Great answer, Claire. Well, Richard, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'd agree with everything that Claire said, and between I think California and the UK, it's similar, and this integrated planning piece is really important. I would say if you've got fully separate electricity network regulation, which we have in the UK, I think there is a case for making it just a bit more gung-ho and actually being more confident, because the cost of so we know that the system is going to need to be upgraded for capacity, and it's aging at the same time. So I think there's two things you can do. One is that when you're doing your normal replacement, so maybe the wire's 100 years old or whatever and it needs to be replaced, just make it a bit bigger. That's an obvious one, and the cost of doing that is quite limited. And then if you're doing upgrades, so if you're doing broader upgrades for capacity, there is a case just for making them X% bigger than you expect them to need to be, because that cost is very, very marginal. And history shows that when you increase electrical capacity, demand will come, and that might not come, but actually the marginal investment is quite minimal. So there's a case for regulators to, I guess, allow more anticipatory investment, we call it in the UK, and it's probably the same term everywhere, but that's not the norm, and B, just to allow that investment to be a little bit bigger than you otherwise might have done.
I think, Brian, the other one thing I would add, Andrew, is that we need, this just puts much more emphasis on the importance of, I'll use the loose word, demand management, and that is that we've sized our grid to meet peak demand on electricity. We're going to add two sources of energy, cars and gas, that are both peaky. That is, they're not used uniformly throughout the day for homes and small businesses. If we don't get on top of this, we are going to have a problem. The benefit is going to be significant, because if we can move demand during the day to flatten it out somewhat, it'll be much better for everything. So I think that this whole question of tariff design and using modern technology to do this is going to be one of the important parts of the transition generally, and the electrification specifically.
Yeah, great answers. I mean, a couple of points I would add. I think home weatherization actually can play an important role here. So actually improving, Australia's households are just terribly inefficient. And if we actually just improving the efficiency of households makes people more comfortable, like that's a primary reason to do it. There's resilience benefit, but it also helps deal with this, helps lower the demand on gas or electricity when during high heating or cooling days. The other thing I mentioned that I didn't show, but I think sometimes we think of it's helpful to see the numbers, the value of the asset base, electricity versus gas. So total, I showed, I think in our last webinar, the total cost of the electricity network regulated asset base is about $105 billion. The gas regulated asset base of gas networks is about 12 billion. So it's about 10%. So it's not the same order of magnitude. So increasing gas, or rather the increase in electricity spending, electricity network spending, won't feel quite so bad because it's really off of a very high base already, if that makes sense. So the percentage change in people's bills will look a lot smaller. All right, I'm going to go to audience Q&A and keep them coming, even though we're running out of time. So Jill Armstrong's asked the question, could the panel make any predictions about when the tipping point for gas networks might be? For example, would it be at a certain percentage of users leaving the gas network, or if gas reaches a certain percentage below current levels, I guess, and that's when the question being when really the death spiral, as it's been called, or the vicious cycle might begin?
The obvious answer, I think, is that the death spiral starts after people have been put on life support. So we've actually got on top of this before the death spiral, right? So I think part of that is that you can, at the very local level, think about it this way. Because of the nature of what we have to do house by house, you can't just shut down bits of the network, although in some parts of the world who are planning to do it that way, do it almost suburb by suburb or locality by locality. What you can do is keep a very close eye on what's going on, because if you're only left with, in some suburbs, 2 or 3 houses and 2 or 3 streets left, then it'd be cheaper to pay them just to shut down that small part of the network progressively. So they're the sort of things you can start to do, I think, which would help avoid the debt spiral. But the main thing about avoiding a tipping point is to making sure we don't have a tipping point. That is that we've had a lot of reasonably smooth curves, and you put up that very chart that, or I think it might have been Richard put up that chart that showed what happened with because of gaslighting. I don't think we're going to see it quite like that, as you said, Brian. But things tend to be in this world happen slowly, and then they happen really fast. And what we need to try and get on top of ASAP is now, because we are already seeing disconnections from the gas network. So it's not too early to start now to avoid a major tipping point.
Yeah, we'll share in the when we share the presentations with everyone, we'll also share some material from the Rocky Mountain Institute, who's done some analysis on this. And if you look, I mean, it's complicated and it varies by, you can't answer this question definitively, but if you think about S curves for technology adoption, which start slowly and then grow very rapidly, very quickly, historically it often is an S curve in reverse for the decline in some of these technologies. So it starts slowly, but then increases dramatically on the back end. So
and we'll see the same thing with electric cars as well. Petrol cars will go through the same problem, right?
Yeah, and service,
and
service
at some point
stations,
you won't be able to, one day you'll be able to buy petrol from your local service station, and a week later you won't, because they won't be there anymore.
All right, so we've got one more question, which I sort of love, and I might ask it slightly different. So the question is there an optimal time to nationalize in order to minimize overall costs? I guess the other question I would ask is, I just mentioned this, stat about the regulated asset base, the value of the regulated asset base under the AER's current accounting structure. Is that the value? Is that actually the true market value of gas assets? What they tell the regulators? If you just went out and tried to buy this stuff on the open market, is that what it would cost?
I guess the answer to that one is, of course, it's not. But that depends upon what assumptions you make about the future. So I think one of the interesting questions here is almost for the prudential authorities and the people who finance these businesses, particularly when they've been highly geared. That is, they carry a lot of debt relative to the equity in the business, and the banks should be asking, okay, are you guys going to be able to continue to fund that debt? Because if you see the sort of charts that you've seen from the three of us today, the answer is maybe not. And what they should at least be doing in their annual reports, their annual financial reports, and this is just good accounting practice, is making it very clear what assumptions they are making about the future value of those assets. Because all three of us in your own chart, Brian, have shown that the assumption that it's all going to move smoothly and they're going to get an asset that's going to last the next 50, 60, 70, 80 years is wrong.
Anything overseas, you guys can share on that. Is that a live discussion actually about kind of this was sort of like a big public lie that no one's being honest about, which is the value, the value of the regulated gas assets.
I don't know if Claire wants to go first.
No,
okay,
go ahead.
I'll go as I've started. So it's interesting actually from the Australian perspective, because we've seen Macquarie come in and buy a huge chunk of UK gas infrastructure when everyone's been saying it needs to be run down in 25 years. And so no one quite knows what to make of that, whether they think there's actually a game to be played around keeping it going or whether they've been missold it. It's an interesting perspective because all of the modelling is showing it's got to be run down. And yeah, Brian, so there's this thing called premium RAV, which is basically the percentage on top of the regulatory value, and there's a significant premium RAV on UK networks, and that's primarily a function of how profitable they've been for the previous years, actually. I just want to say the actual question about when to nationalise, I don't think that's the biggest question. The biggest issue is let's stop pumping money into it first, because the sooner you do that, the quicker you're actually reducing the size of the problem, and then you can start thinking about accelerated depreciation. Then, I mean, you don't need to nationalize them. It just feels to me like that's and it doesn't work in some countries because it just is impossible. But for a country which has a history of nationalization of energy assets and is trying to do this project extremely quickly, there doesn't seem to be another solution when you're trying to run it like a project, because how do you coordinate it? How do you shut it down street by street and do those things that Tony was saying about if it's still owned and run as a profitable private network? So I actually think that the first question you've got to ask yourself is, how are we going to fairly distribute these costs?
Claire, anything from you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really clear that or important that our regulators make it clear to gas utilities what expectations they have around what is being done to reduce expansion of the gas system. Is under what instances is expansion acceptable? What kind of, at least up until very recently in California, you could actually get an allowance to cover a portion of the cost of extending a gas system because of a kind of outdated belief that additional customers coming on helped reduce the costs for everyone. That's obviously no longer the case, so we've removed that in California. So both, what is the expectation around expansion of the gas system? What expectations do you have when it comes to decision-making to repair or replace existing parts of the gas system? And then what is your expectation about what's being done with portions of the gas system that aren't due for repair or replacement, but aren't fully depreciated? Making those expectations is clear so that gas utilities aren't just assuming that they can continue along with business as usual and will get bought out and rescued at the end of the day. It's making those agreements and saying anything that's left over after you've met these expectations will be taken on by others.
Well, thanks for that, Claire, and Tony, Richard, Andrew, and Kirsty. I've really enjoyed this discussion. I think it's very timely and important, and really, when we think about current and future energy consumers, making a plan for the future of the gas distribution network has to be one of our top priorities. Carol, take us away.
All right. Well, yeah, I agree, Brian. I think we brought this series of webinars to a perfect end, and I couldn't think of a better way to conclude what has been such an informative and insightful sessions. So thank you very much, Richard, Claire, and Tony, for sharing your insights and knowledge with us. Thank you once again, Kirsty and Andrew, for being part of this project and for spending your Friday mornings with us for the past 3 weeks. Thank you, Brian, for leading this project from inception to fruition, for giving me the opportunity to be part of it, and for facilitating the discussion we had during the past month. And a special thanks to everyone who joined us today. So I hope you leave today with a better sense of what needs to change in how we currently plan the energy system, so that we can achieve this bright and affordable energy future that we all envisage. I'm sure that there will be lots of challenges and learnings along the way, but I also trust that these webinars have provided insights and benchmarking opportunities about what can be done and how it can be done. So I put it into the chat, the link to the feedback survey. You can also see on the screen. You can just use your mobile to scan the QR code. Please tell us what you liked about today, what you thought about the whole series, what do you want to see us discuss in future webinars, and by the end of today, you will receive an email from me with slides and a few additional resources. So this brings us to an official close. Enjoy the rest of the day and have a great weekend. Bye.